by the Wiener Holocaust Library and the Armenian Institute. I'm Barbara Warnock from the Wiener Holocaust Library, and we're really delighted to welcome you here today to mark the publication of this important book, The Resistance Network, and to have Khatchig Mouradian here, the author, here to talk about his work. And in a sense, this is a follow-up to a talk that he did at the library a few years ago about the research, and now he's published the work. And so we're delighted to have Khatchig here tonight to discuss his book. And he'll be in conversation with Dr. Rebecca Jinx, who is the Chair of Trustees at the Armenian Institute. And before I hand over to the two of them, just a kind of few words about a few different things. So for those of you who don't know, the Wiener Holocaust Library in Russell Square is the world's oldest archive of material about the Nazi era and the Holocaust. But we also very much have an interest in and some collections related to other genocides. And so holding events such as this are very important to us, and working with the Armenian Institute is very important to us as well. So we're really delighted to have this event, and we think, you know, we're a very appropriate sort of place to be hosting the event. We have a busy program of events on various different topics, so you can look at our website to find out more. Obviously, in these times of pandemic, we've shifted to online events, and that's still the case at the moment, that all of our events are online. So just a few words about this. We're recording this event, and the recording will be available on YouTube probably from tomorrow, so you can let other people know about it. All of the audience are muted. There will be a chance to ask questions after Becky and Khatchig have had their discussion, but could you please put your questions in the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat and monitoring that, and then sort of fielding your questions for Khatchig and Becky. So you will have a chance, if you have questions, to put them to the audience. So I'm just going to now just introduce our two speakers and then hand over to them. So first of all, Dr. Rebecca Jinx is a historian of comparative genocide and humanitarianism. And before she got her current job at Royal Holloway, where she completed her doctorate in 2013, she taught in the history departments of the University of East Anglia and the University of Exeter. Her PhD thesis was published in 2016, entitled Representing Genocide, the Holocaust as Paradigm, and it examines the ways in which representations of the Holocaust have influenced how other genocides are understood and represented. She is currently working on a project encompassing gender humanitarianism and photography in the aftermath of the Armenian Genocide. And as I've said, she's the Chair of Trustees at the Armenian Institute. So our author tonight, Dr. Khatchig Mouradian, the author of The Resistance Network, the Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria 1915 to 18, is a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University in the city of New York. He is the author of articles on genocide, mass violence and unarmed resistance, and the co-editor of a forthcoming book on late Ottoman history, and the editor of the peer-reviewed journal, The Armenian Review. He holds a PhD in history from the Strasler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, and a graduate certificate in conflict resolution from UMass Boston. He is the recipient of a Kalusta Gulbenkian Research Fellowship to write the history of the Armenian community in China in the 19th and 20th centuries. And he's also the recipient of the first Harald Dink Justice and Freedom Award of the Organization of Istanbul Armenians. He serves on the executive committee of the Society of Armenian Studies since 2015. So I'll now hand over to Becky to kick things off tonight.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Barbara. for that introduction. Khatchig, I'm really pleased to finally be able to chat with you and to chat with you about this book, which for me anyway is based on absolutely fascinating research. So just to kind of frame tonight, I mean, for me as a historian, it plugs some real gaps in our knowledge and our interpretation. And that is because you wind together basically the story of what happened to Armenian deportees once they got to northern Syria, those of them who actually made it there. But within that story, what you're doing is exploring Armenian humanitarian efforts during the genocide. You're exploring the agency and actions of Armenian genocide victims, who are often viewed as very passive and helpless. And you're also exploring the development and evolution of this kind of network of transit and concentration camps that sort of dotted the desert, basically. So there's a lot of layers of analysis going on in there, and a lot of those are really very fresh for us as well. So that's my kind of standpoint on the book. I think you know that anyway. And perhaps we can pick up some of these strands of analysis, or the audience will want to. But perhaps just to open, could you just sketch out for us this history, this basic history of the kind of succession of deportations throughout 1915 and 16 for us?
Yes, thank you for that introduction. It is, so, you know, the typical, I would say, the Reader's Digest version of what happened during the Armenian Genocide is, you know, under the cover of World War I, the Ottoman Turkish authorities began a process of deporting the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire. And at the same time, there were arrests of Armenian intellectuals, leaders in Istanbul and in other major cities throughout the empire. These deportations were accompanied by localized massacres, as well as and a general direction in which most of these deportees were forced, you know, were headed was what is modern day Syria. So this is, and then ultimately, again, the main narrative, the genocide script, perhaps you would call it, is that these deportees will arrive in Syria, and there's going to be a second wave of massacres in Deir ez-Zor and the surrounding region, and that is essentially the story of the Armenian genocide. And in many ways, of course, there's a lot more to it in historiography. But one of the things that I try to do in my work is sort of first tell the story differently, in a sense that not say it in a way in which the narrative is, you know, this is what happened to the Armenians, this is what happened to the Armenians, etc. While rather think about it as a situation where the Armenians at every step of the way have a role and are engaged in different ways to in efforts to save their own lives or push back against many of these policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the kind of main contributions that you make, really. It's that tracking the succession of camps and showing at each stage how people, you know, who are either within the camps or outside them are trying to kind of resist, basically. And you also show very well the kind of escalation, I think, of genocidal policies over this time period. So tell me, what led you to actually research this topic? Was there kind of a personal history or reason in it, or just a gap that you spotted?
Yeah, there's certainly a personal connection. My grandparents on both sides were child survivors of the Armenian Genocide, and growing up in Lebanon, I was, you know, exposed to this history in a number of ways. In fact, my primary school was in the Armenian Catholic State compound, and there was an Armenian Genocide memorial chapel there. There still is, and which is essentially full of bones, skulls brought from Deir ez-Zor. And I remember even as children, we used to, every April 24th, we'd go there and essentially, you know, to pay our respects. So in many ways, this was part of my my childhood, my upbringing. But at the same time, perhaps later on, there were a few things that sort of triggered my interest in this particular episode, region, and aspect of the Armenian genocide. 2 years into my writing my dissertation, I still was thinking that I'm going to be writing about something else. So this was a last minute turn that I made at some point in my third year. As a result of a couple of things. One was a visit to Syria, to many of the places that I cover in the book. This was right before the war. And the other was, in fact, a meeting with a historian who essentially made the case that because he hasn't found any documents about the massacres of Armenians in the Ottoman archives, in their Zor specifically, he doesn't believe there were such massacres. So probably these were two of the main reasons that sort of prompted me to investigate this this area more. My interest was their Zor. That's where it started. And then, of course, as these things happen, you start realizing that what you're looking for is not really what you're looking for, and then the circle expands, and the things that interest you become different. I was going to write another book about victimhood and destruction. That's what I set out to do. It's just that, fortunately, I didn't.
So. I think we're all kind of familiar with that, aren't we? The sense of finding that source or a certain problematic just kind of appears. That's certainly what led me to start working on this kind of related topic. And then you can't let it go, can you? But I think, I mean, for you, it's really interesting hearing you talk about the kind of memory and growing up as a child, coupled much later with this academic aspect, because I think one of the things that you bring up here, one of the things that immediately always springs to my mind is why historians haven't really written about this phase before in any kind of depth. As you say, there's always a kind of, for Armenian communities, is a synonym for the undescribable. And it's omnipresent in survivor accounts and memories, but scholars have largely, as you say, avoided retracing this path. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, in many ways, that narrative of the Armenian genocide that was largely built after the model of the Holocaust of the 80s, this kind of intentionalist, unrelenting kind of every single Armenian needs to be killed. The process doesn't stop. There is no local variations that are really understood, or there's no attempt to really see this other dynamics. Was very much a dominant narrative in the beginning of when scholars were tackling this issue. And of course, the stakes were high. There's denial. There's other aspects that really, and I talk about this, that really factors into this. But at any person in the past several decades who just knows this kind of general picture history, or is or the way it is typically represented in the historiography, any person reading a memoir or listening to a survivor account would have to deal with some serious cognitive dissonance, in a sense that it's really difficult to make sense of all of this. So either you have to dismiss it in order for this narrative to hold, or you have to engage with it and try to make sense of it. So this was at the core, and I think that in many ways historians try to. It's only in recently, a number of scholars have really made major transformations in the field by tackling a lot of these issues. I give the example of Hakan Dadarian in the book because I think it's he's a pioneer, and he's acknowledged as essentially the person who established the field of Armenian genocide studies in many ways. And still, for him, what is referred to as the, essentially the Auschwitz of the Armenian genocide over and over again. is just a footnote. And literally, and I actually cite the footnote. So it's this shocking thing, because it's very difficult to account for a few things when you try to tackle this region. One is what is happening between the arrival of the deportees into Ottoman Syria, from May of 1915 until September, October, and then all the way into the 1916. Because what happens is that there's almost a year where you do not have in this particular region any massacres. I do document the Rasulayn massacres, which start in March 1916. So that model is different, and it requires a different kind of thinking when you have this kind of gap where there's all kinds of other forms of destruction that is happening. So this is one element. The other element is, of course, sources. In many of these places that I'm covering, you do not have the languages, you do not have the missionary records, the diplomatic records, providing the kind of information that they do in other places. Most of these concentration camps, for example, and I would say more than half of the book focuses on them, are off limits to many diplomats and missionaries, right? So oftentimes language becomes an issue. And of course, many scholars who've written on the Armenian genocide, focus mostly on Ottoman documents, German, English, and not so much Armenian. And of course, Armenian documents are also considered. Even some Armenian scholars have been careful using it in order not to be accused of being tainted. So many of these factors played a role. Ultimately, though, as I mentioned, several scholars, chief among whom Raymond Kevorkian, in his monumental work on the Armenian genocide, as well as others, Taner Akçam, Hilma Kaiser, and others, have offered a more nuanced explanation of what is transpiring on the ground.
I think that's still quite generous of you in some ways, because you do bring in survivor voices and Armenian voices still in a way that others, I think, don't. You're much more empathetic and grounded in them, and I think that's the real shift that, as someone who identifies as a kind of comparative genocide scholar anyway myself, that's the shift that I've been waiting for in a way in Armenian genocide studies. And I think you're right also to talk about that loosening and starting to see it as a process which evolves and isn't just kind of the Auschwitz model of kind of unrelenting intentional violence. And it's that nuancing of the situation, which I think is a real step forwards here. And I think another way that you bring that to light in a way is a kind of spatial approach, a spatial history approach. And by that, I mean, you pay attention to urban spaces. You talk about hospitals, you talk about hotels, orphanages, private homes. And you also think about rural spaces that the camps were located in, which are normally on the outskirts of towns. Could you just tell us a little bit about these different spaces and how they either helped the resistance movement or indeed hindered it, or the perpetrators, and why you took this approach and why you think it's helpful in helping us to understand the genocide?
I do think that in many ways, I managed, or I tried to manage, to tell this, the history of this, what's happening during World War I in a region that is sort of a triangle between Aleppo, Rasulayn, and Deir ez-Zor in Ottoman Syria, both chronologically and spatially at the same time. So I start with Aleppo, and it's the first half of the book has an urban focus. The second half of the book has a rural and more desert areas and concentration camps. And at the same time, that's the path that I take. So as deportees are arriving, Aleppo is an important node. So and there's an integral element that very much is of Aleppo. So in many ways, recent scholarship on space, on urban spaces, violence, emphasizes many of these components that sort of are the inspiration of the way I tackle the urban dynamic. For me, because I'm looking at these connections between individuals, their interactions, their prior relationships, it is important for much of this to be grounded in place, right? So in many, also at the same time, as far as the genocide itself is concerned, the genocide is not just happening in Aleppo and in Ottoman Syria, but it is of these regions. So there's, you know, groups, individuals in the region are shaping these dynamics. So that was also important. So in many ways, even though in the book I was very careful to not go into much detail, I sort of tried to know how many steps there are from the Baron Hotel that I talk about to the Armenian hospital, to the Armenian church where the council meetings were being held. I knew spatially where everything is, and this has very much helped me ground what is going on and also establish the connections. Many of the characters who are central in this story are individuals whose, you know, I've gotten to know their problems. I've gotten to know their challenges, who didn't like whom, and etc. And much of this, again, was playing out in the middle of genocide and war, just like it does in the middle of any average boring day in any corner of the world. So in that sense, I think the urban dimension, so that kind of the place aspect was important. And also one quick thing, it also grounded my understanding of this network and the way in which these people are connected, and how these connections ultimately are more important than the individuals themselves. You know, having that kind of understanding of that space helped me do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you start to think about it in terms of a meeting room, it becomes less about the people and more about how the space facilitates these discussions and who can get there, who can sneak around. I think your point about the number of steps between is, you know, or indeed how long it would take to walk from one camp to another is really enlightening, and it helps the reader really understand what's going on for everyone. Something else that you wrote that really stood out to me was, at one point you mentioned that a camp was put on a field of clay, and so when it rained, the whole thing is a swamp almost immediately. And it's that sort of detail and sort of geographical understanding of it, which then helps the historian to say, well, you know, whether the authorities intended it to be on a clay or not, the result of that is that, you know, it enables genocide, you know, completely. Can I just stick with this point about space in a way, but to bring it round to the issue of concentration camps? Because normally when we think about concentration camps, we're thinking about barbed wire and enclosed spaces that are impossible to get out of and so on. What did these camps look like and how did they function?
Many of these camps, in fact, were not the typical image we have of concentration camps. Whether we're talking about the colonial concentration camps or concentration camps during World War II. Many of them did not, in fact, have, you know, barbed wire surrounding them. Just a couple that I know of actually had any walls of any kind separating them from the outside, and much of this was because of the use of the natural environment. Many of the camps that I document and I talk about along the Euphrates were typically, there is, for the perpetrators, there's this ideal spot to create these camps. They typically are supposed to be within some kind of distance from either a place where they can communicate, like a telegram center, or any kind of form of communication that they can have with with the central authorities and the regional authorities, and at the same time, clearly regions that can be controlled easily. So for instance, whenever there's a town on the eastern bank of the Euphrates, you have the camp on the western bank of the Euphrates, and you have the bridges guarded. The perimeter is always guarded by gendarmes and others of many of these camps. And within the camps, there are there are camp guards, overwhelmingly Armenian, in fact, in many of these cases. Also, there are, so it's almost really impossible for people to escape. And even if they do escape, there's nowhere to go, right? memoir after memoir, account after account, you will see cases of people, essentially other locals, nearby villagers are instructed to essentially capture escaping Armenians, sometimes kill them, and you have many examples of this. So it is the kind of situation where between the guards and the natural lay of the land, these people really have nowhere to go in a completely alien for them foreign territory. That's as important as well. They don't know the language. They are now in a world where pretty much everyone speaks Arabic. Turkish is not a language that is commonly used, particularly in that part of the region, etc. So in many ways, barbed wire was something else in the case of the Armenian genocide.
Yeah, and you said at one point that the camps are semi-porous, and I think your discussion about how local people could sometimes buy labour from the camps, or indeed women and girls, or the bribes that were sometimes possible to remain, or indeed the opposite, to move on to the next camp. Just again, as a comparative historian, it just makes me think of some of the recent work that's happening in Holocaust studies, which is showing us that a camp is not a camp is not a camp, and to explain, like you said, in a in a more processual way, what is actually going on here in these camps. We have to think more closely about how they function, how they situate within the local community, and what these kind of porosity, these boundaries are. So I think that's really interesting. And you said something just now about Armenian Guards, and I think this is brave of you in some ways. You introduce us here to quite a taboo topic, that of Armenians who essentially collaborated with the perpetrators, whether as camp guards or as carriage drivers who extorted deportees and so on. What made you decide to include this history, and what do you think it tells us?
I mean, I don't know what made me decide to include it. I guess I just saw that it's happening a lot, right? I mean, it's the same thing with the whole resistance theme that emerged, right, in the book. It was just, you keep hitting your head. I mean, at some point, right, you start seeing that, what? There's something else going on here, and I gotta investigate it, right? I can just pretend that there's this kind of model that I'm following, and it's enough to help me navigate this space. And that's what happened with resistance when I saw that Armenians are organizing. It's not just individuals, but there's this organized network of loosely connected people, and importantly, many of them being key actors here being Armenians. As opposed to general narrative of Western humanitarians, diplomats, help coming from the West, nearest relief. This is the kind of story, right? And so I incorporate Armenians into this, and I demonstrate that they're at the core of it. But it's not like every Armenian is just engaged in this effort of, endangering their lives in order to save others, right? You see people, just like in any situation, in any society, right? There are people who are trying to save their skin by collaborating. People who are trying to take advantage of the circumstances. This is not just collaborating, but enriching themselves. People who are trying to really benefit from the terrible conditions that Armenians find themselves. And so in many ways, I tried to, and this was a way for me to stay grounded and not turn this into a hagiography of. So on the one hand, telling a story, saying that I'm going to challenge this representation of Armenians as victims, and then I'm going to write a book that represents Armenians as heroes, right? And so that I just wanted to say what's going on and show that there are these nuances, not just in terms of the victims, but also in terms of the perpetrators. Jemal Pasha, the section on Jemal Pasha tries to see him as someone who is both, because of his connections and context. He's part of the perpetrator group and is engaging in these policies and channeling them. And on the other hand, he's also helping many of these key actors in the resistance network for his own other considerations. And typically, if you look at the scholarship on Jemal Pasha, is either a saint who saved Armenians or a perpetrator. And of course, as I mentioned, maybe in an extreme form of censorship, he's actually assassinated for being a perpetrator, right? So it is interesting to see this kind of different kind of way of looking at this space and thinking about how mass violence unfolds in that context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the key thing, isn't it? It's, you know, it's very easy for scholars and other people to read these in terms of moral categories, you know, of the resistors and the collaborators and the heroes and the martyrs and whatever. But you just have to look at what's going on in front of you and to remember that, you know, people are acting according to a context that's set up by other people, you know, by the perpetrators, and there are always nuances of behaviour within that. So I think that's, you know, you don't make too much of a big deal about this. You just let it sit in the narrative, and I appreciated that, because it's not a huge song and dance, and you're not trying to make a huge point about it. It's just, as you said, it's you keep hitting your nose against it, and that's great. So perhaps to follow on from that, then let's talk about Armenians as actors, as agents. You know, you make the point we discussed earlier that scholarship generally portrays Armenians as passive, and you correct this very well. So how does this change our understanding of the history? And I think perhaps, given my own work more interestedly, how does this understanding of Armenian actors change our understanding of the workings of humanitarianism, either during this period or perhaps more generally as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that were very important for me, and you know, one of the things I do in class is ask my students, all right, so tell me in a nutshell what happened during, say, the Rwandan genocide or the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide, right? And this is typically something that happens in the first session. And you will hear these kind of stories that I said are you know, pointing and going in one direction. The target group almost doesn't exist. Things are happening to it, right? And it's understandable because, you know, there is this sense that if we portray the targeted group as completely helpless and saints, right? If, you know, just for good measure, right? The case for this being, you know, a horrible crime and a genocide essentially is strengthened. Mm-hmm. But it actually gives the opposite. It actually plays into the perpetrator's narrative. The perpetrator wants to erase the group, and you're erasing them as well by, you know, so in a way, in this good intentioned way, erasing them from, you know, and making them unable almost to do anything or do, you know, or push back in any way. And that is part of the narrative. And it is true of the Armenian genocide as much as it's true of many other cases of how even the reporting takes place on crimes today. I mean, you know, one of the things that constantly bothers me when I read reporting on even individual like crimes and attacks, etc. Again, there's this effort to erase anything that the target person or group is doing. So this was one concern that sort of I wanted to address. The other was a major issue I had with the way in which, and this came around the centenary of the Armenian Genocide, became a major issue as well. This whole discussion about humanitarianism during World War I and its aftermath, Near East relief, and the huge amounts of funds that were raised. And this has always been a central theme in the United States among Armenians and elsewhere as well, because it's a way of saying, again, denial is so much part of the reason behind this. It's a way of saying, hey, Americans, your ancestors were saving Armenians and raised billions of dollars in today's money, and now your government denies it, right, or doesn't acknowledge it. So the emphasis was about all those people, right? And at the same time, I'm looking at these documents. First of all, there's no way during the Armenian Genocide for the diplomats and the missionaries who are receiving these sums of money from the West, from the United States and elsewhere, to actually go around in concentration camps and distribute funds, right? The people who are doing this are primarily Armenians, Muslims, Jews, and other locals who know the terrain, who know the territory, they're risking their lives as they're doing it. Their story is erased. Their story doesn't exist. family members and descendants know that their grandparents or great-grandparents did something, etc. And in those cases, of course, there's no realization of the connectedness of all of this and the coordinated manner in which all of this was being done. So in many ways, these Armenians were being caught, on the one hand, were being subjected to genocide. On the other hand, they were being subjected to humanitarianism. And they're stuck in the middle doing nothing, right? Depending on your luck, you're either saved by Near East relief or killed by the Turks. This is the story. And again, the book challenges that head on and portrays how many of these efforts were actually coordinated, connects the Near East relief effort with the organized effort. I'm actually seeing in the audience here Grace Shivadjian, who's a descendant of Harun Shivadjian, whose picture actually graces the cover of the book. So it's very interesting to see. So this is the other concern that I had that sort of I tried to tackle, and this says a lot about also modern humanitarianism. Just a quick couple points. For example, the way in which when we read reports by human rights organizations or humanitarian organizations in the here and now, it feels like there's this there's so much is being done, but there's nobody on the ground doing anything significant. There are people who are working for us. They're not people who are essentially guiding us, or we are essentially walking by them, not leading them in any way. The way in which the narrative is told sometimes, eerily is reminiscent of many of these reports by missionaries and diplomats, who sometimes, in fact, even were more generous and did acknowledge many of these names, etc. So I do think that's also a critical component. I can go on and on this, but I'll shut up here.
Let me just say to any of the audience, please put your questions in the chat. I'm not running out of questions, but please stop me from talking. Can I just pick up on something there? You were talking about, well, I mean, it's kind of intersects with some of the things that I've been looking at in terms of modern humanitarianism and the relief efforts immediately after the war. And what I saw and tried to critique was exactly what you're saying, this idea that humanitarians kind of pitch up and they're doing wonderful things and they're the only people who can change anything. And I tried to pull apart the kind of self-congratulatory narratives and the heroic kind of spin they put on everything, and say actually what these people are doing is trying to implement their own idea of what the Armenian nation should be after the war, in a developmental kind of strain very much, which I think is very modern. Do you get the feeling, that's kind of post-war, post-emergency-ish stage humanitarianism?
Are you there,
Becky? Oh. Not sure. Did you have, Khatchig, enough of Becky's question to start an answer, and then we can see it?
I'm not sure, but I can. Yeah, but I can fill the silence by saying a few things about this. In a number of ways, yes, there's this sense of, in modern day humanitarianism as well, and we see this, by the way, in a number of cases where you have human rights organizations talking about their work as if there are no local actors who are doing similar work, as if they are not, and in many ways, instead of empowering and standing next to the group and trying to think what kind of vision they have of their own future and how do they want to do that, they essentially insert themselves as saviors into the picture. Yes, Becky, sorry for that.
Hi, sorry. This happens a little bit too often, usually when I'm teaching, so I might leave my students to it, but it's more difficult to do that right now. I don't know what you were saying, obviously. Where I was going was to talk about post-war humanitarians, external humanitarians coming in and trying to create their own vision of the Armenian nation and what it should look like. You're focusing on a network that's very much responding to an emergency situation. Do you see them also trying to create an Armenian nation, or is it just saving at that point? Is it, is there anything developmental going on in their eyes at all?
There is, in a sense that they're trying to, in the minds of at least some of these actors, there is some sense of how they can go about in this horrendous environment to actually salvage something around which a nation can be rebuilt once this is over. And there are two anchors for a number of these actors in this regard. One are the children. There's a very organized effort to save children, create orphanages, secretly do their best, and you see this also covered in the book. I mentioned Ottoman Syria. He plays a central role in this. Thousands of children are actually saved through the effort of his team. So that's one. The other is intellectuals. I give the example of Hotel Baron. This was one of the places where Cemal Pasha, one of the leading figures of the triumvirate and essentially the king of the region, was essentially stayed. But at the same time, at the very same hotel, and the owners of the hotel, the Mazlubian brothers, invested in saving Armenian intellectuals, sometimes hiding them in the very same spot where just a few rooms to the left or right or above them, Cemal Pasha and his officers were staying. So it does give you that kind of sense of them having a kind of thinking about how to move forward. Just a quick note, again, the book doesn't cover the period after the genocide, but if you look at the Armenian language press in the immediate aftermath of the genocide, in the 20s in particular, there's a lot of backlash against Near East relief, right? And particularly about this specific aspect that you mentioned, which is trying to shape how the Armenian nation should look like. And you have these Armenian, intellectuals, journalists, writers saying that, well, hold on for a second, right? We have a different vision of this. So that's also interesting. But the seeds of this, in many ways, and I say this in the final chapter, there is no straight, essentially this abrupt, even though in Ottoman Syria, with Ottoman defeat and withdrawal, the genocide is over, right? There's no transition, etc. But at the same time, still, beginning with 1917, things are a little different, much calmer. And actually, even after the withdrawal of the Ottoman forces, there was a massacre in Aleppo in 1919. This is, again, essentially largely erased from Armenian memory. Aleppo that had never witnessed a massacre during the Armenian genocide. And it really is another way in which the story is complicated, and there is no clear-cut line of demarcation between the genocide and its aftermath in that sense.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a really important point. Let me just pick up on something else here, because you've been mentioning various kind of luminous individuals who are absolutely key one way or another in to the resistance network, but you also say, the network was such that if one person died, was killed, or stepped down, others stepped up into their place. So is there a tension there? What's happening?
Yes. So in many ways, this was it was happening naturally. One of the things is that, and I talk a little bit about this in the beginning as well, the period before the genocide. This network of organized different groups and individuals coming together and working would not have been possible had there not been Armenian institutions and organizations in Syria prior to the war. So essentially, it is many of these actors who are going underground and working clandestinely when the genocide begins to unfold in the region. So, so although there are these key players, almost every single one of these key actors at different points in time are either killed or arrested or exiled or burn out and are essentially removed from the picture. You know, to give an example, again, Reverend Eskijian, you know, he dies a few months into it. It's like, you know, one of the central figures dying in episode 2, right? It's like, it is, this is true of pretty much every single person. The leader of the Armenian Council that I talk about, Armenian Apostolic Church in Aleppo, is arrested and spends the entire period of the war in prison. There are, you know, the Hotel Baron, the brothers, are exiled to Zahle. The Catholicos is exiled to Jerusalem. And I'm not even talking about many couriers that I reference in the book who are essentially outright killed as they're, you know, distributing funds and assistance, etc. So in many ways, almost nobody, you know, keeps their position for the duration of the war. But what you have is other people coming in and stepping in and playing a role there as well. Like I talk about the replacement of, you know, again, different members of these committees. And I try to show that, again, this is, if there is a hero here, the heroes are in many ways, it's not individuals. It's like the whole network and the web itself and the way it's set up is actually what is accomplishing what is being accomplished. And the individuals are important nodes, and they do a lot. But many of them, in fact, will do too much, and they're going to become victims of that, you know, pushing too hard by getting arrested or dying or from disease. Some of them are going to die of disease that they get from the deportees. So it is that kind of situation. And by the end of the war, to be fair, you realize that the network is in complete tatter. It's you know, at that point, after 3-4 years of just people getting killed and taking, you know, arrested, etc., etc., it's not what it was, you know, even a year before. But still, you look at the names and the faces, they're different people. After the war, to connect with your earlier question, many of these actors, those who were in prison in particular, will return and play a critical role in the rebuilding of the Armenian communities, whether it's in Aleppo or beyond.
Let me hand over to the audience now, because Grace has written a question that I think links quite directly on from that. And she says, denial is the last phase of genocide. What you and other scholars like you are doing is a form of resistance against this final phase. From your perspective, what other impactful forms of resistance are available to the rest of us to pursue?
Yes, it's important to fight against denial, but I would say that if we're using my definition of resistance, because I'm not really operating in a reality where my life is at risk, it's, you know, I would not call it resistance, but thank you. Many people who are doing that in Turkey today, particularly under difficult circumstances, yeah, perhaps we can use that term for them. But in many ways, denial is an integral part of genocide, not just the last phase, but in every single phase. Cemal Pasha, as I describe in the book, is engaging in denial as the genocide is happening and unfolding. So it's an integral part of genocide throughout. And I think that we are at a phase, and I'm just one example of this, of many, where we can actually, while being mindful of denial and creating awareness about mass violence and genocide, we are at a phase where we can actually, even on a certain level, do scholarship and do work that explores these experiences without having constantly that sword of denial hanging over our heads, which is something that many of the scholars before us had to reckon with all the time. Many scholars do not have the luxury of exploring different aspects of the Armenian genocide and its implications in a context where there were so few people writing about this, and the denial was in an organized fashion bearing down on them. That reality is, has gradually changed over the years. We're not there yet, but I think that, this kind of work would not have been possible in a reality where, as I said, denial is hanging over my head like a sword.
I think you're completely right, and here's where the comparative perspective really helps, right? Nobody in Holocaust studies would ever even think about bothering with deniers. We find we might study it and we more or less know what it's about, but no one would have it hanging over their heads. No one would feel it necessary to try and rebut it point by point. We just get on with it. So I think it's just so very welcome that that's happening now in the Armenian sphere. Maybe to link on to something that you just said, Rubina Kingwell's written a long question, which I'll paraphrase. With regard to Jamal Pasha and his ilk, do you find that there's a desire to rehabilitate some of these people, perhaps by trying to find righteous Turks, so-called? And in that vein, would you say that Halide Edip was a perpetrator or a humanitarian? Nice binary, given her methods in Turkifying so many orphans.
Yes, so I'm not making the case that, by the way, Jamal Pasha was a humanitarian. What I try to do in the book is actually saying that presenting Jamal Pasha as just this just does not correspond to reality, right? And it's not a point that actually it's just based on what I see and the material that I see and what is going on, right? It doesn't come with notions that Jamal Pasha is a representative of the CUP or anything of that sort. He is a person who is very much invested in the process of the destruction of the Armenian nation and in the breaking apart of Armenian community life. That is at the center of this. I would, in many ways, in the case of the Armenian genocide, even Talat Pasha doesn't really care if there are a couple Armenians in every village, if there is no Armenian school, if there is no Armenian life, it's not possible for Armenian community to reconstitute itself. A lot of the orders, that's what they show, right? So the fact that there's a few Armenians, who have survived here and there is not something that is, and this is why it's important to not think about it as the way in which we used to think, in fact, about the Holocaust. So that's one. The other point is that I do think, and I'm very critical of attempts to rehabilitate or look for righteous Turks, right? I'm not looking for righteous Turks. I'm not looking for bad Armenians. I'm not looking for Armenian heroes. I'm trying to see what is going on. And in most cases, though, the picture of the perpetrators is always complicated, right? They will be saving people, and even when they're saving people, of course, they have certain interests and they have a certain agenda. Our role is to understand that. Ultimately, though, people like Halide Edip, right, who are part of a process of destruction. It depends on how we think about destruction, right? If the definition that I just outlined is to hold, right? If the idea is to erase Armenian existence as a community, destroy Armenian community life, right? Of course, Halide Edip is implicated in this. Absolutely no question. And therefore, she's a perpetrator. But Halide Edip, if you look at her life, she's also a number of other things. Identity is not just, she's not just a Turk, let's say, right? And when we talk about Halide Edip and just box her into that position, that reality, that position becomes very difficult to defend, right? She plays a critical role in the process of genocide, and it's important to identify that and point to that. But she's also very different from her vision of erasure and destruction and genocide is different than the vision of people such as Talat Pasha and others who are the driving force behind the genocide. And their idea is just complete physical destruction, annihilation, etc. There's interesting work being done by a number of scholars on this, including Levna Ekmekcioglu and others, on not just during the genocide, but Halide Edip's figure after the genocide, and her interactions with other Armenian women who have expectations from her as someone who's a feminist, etc. I can say more, but again, let me.
No, I think you're right. It's for the historian, we tend to avoid the labels, right? And when you see something that looks like a contradiction, it just never is. There's always a way to explain it, and it's just about paying attention to those seeming contradictions, I think, and you do that so very well. I think we've got time for one last question. Thank you, Barbara. Michael Riff writes, I wonder whether you could say something about how Armenian politics ended into the formation of the networks to which you refer. Have I got that right? I think, yeah.
Well, entered?
Yeah, sorry, entered. Yeah, thank you.
How Armenian politics played into this? Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things that happens is that, so there were Armenian political parties in, so there was a small Armenian community in Aleppo, there was Armenian Apostolic, Catholic, and Protestant churches, Armenian political parties. It was impossible for the political parties, obviously, to operate in this reality. Many of its leaders were arrested, etc. So initially, many of these individuals were operating around the church and organizing relief efforts that I document, and the local authorities had tacitly approved this. And then eventually they go underground and they're working together. Now, this is the narrative, right? This is how it is from a distance. But if you look closely, of course, there's all kinds of tensions. And I document some of this. In the case of one committee that I look at, whose archives, the Armenian Apostolic Church of Aleppo archives I've used, right? The committee has issues with essentially the person who is the chairperson of the committee, the chair, and they all, resign. And then the Catholicos has to come back and tell them not to resign, etc. So there's all these tensions that, one might think, well, you know what, like this is genocide, and these people are, upset because one day the priest came in and just stormed into their room and said, you guys leave here, I need to hold a meeting in this room, right? So there's like this kind of petty stuff going on as well. But it's also important to realize that many of these people, right, it's easy for us to look from, back 100 years and say, there's a genocide. What are these people doing? Well, for them, this is the reality, right? There are things happening. In fact, in the early months, they had no idea even that what is coming is the entire utter destruction of the Armenian nation. They're thinking that there are these deportees that are arriving from different parts near Aleppo, and they're going to eventually go back home. And they operate with that kind of assumption, so much so that they are giving individual attention to individual deportees who have minor problems. So there's a girl that I talk about in the book who was having eyesight problems, and they arranged for her to be brought to Aleppo so that she's examined. Like, if these people had any sense of what is coming, they would think differently about their resources. But that's the reality of it. So much of this is happening at the same time. Personal rivalries is another example, by the way. Two central figures in this book are Aharon Shirajian and Reverend Eskijian. These two people did not like one another. So it's interesting to see these dynamics. And much of this, of course, the more you zoom out, the less you see, right? But ultimately, once you zoom in and then you zoom out, you see the bigger picture differently. And yes, it is a picture of destruction, genocide. I always say the Armenian genocide is not as bad as you think when you look closely. It is actually worse than what you think. because once you've come to that level and you've seen what is happening, actually, that the fact that these are human beings that are, that are not evil, perpetrators, the devil, right? And are oscillating between doing a couple of nice favors and then killing thousands of people actually makes it worse. Because it humanizes them, and suddenly we find ourselves surrounded by human beings who are committing horrible crimes instead of surrounded by angels and demons.
I think that sounds like a brilliant note to end on, actually. Both your final line and the point about zooming in and zooming out, and just because it speaks, I think, so very well to the different perspectives that you adopt in that book. That's just incredibly effective. So thank you for chatting. Sorry I disappeared for a minute or two. And I will hand over now, I think, back to Barbara, just to end us off.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Becky. And thank you both for just such a stimulating discussion. And I think it's really brought home to us the extent to which, Khatchig's book is introducing all sorts of, new ideas and important complications, I think to the story. So it's been really fascinating, stimulating conversation. I put in the chat a couple of links to buy the book if people scroll up, so please do that. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. Thank you very much to Khatchig and Becky again, and thank you to the Armenian Institute as well for co-hosting this event. And both the Wiener Holocaust Library and the Armenian Institute look forward to seeing you again at future events. So good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Barbara for hosting it.
No problem.
Thank you, Khatchig and Becky. So interesting.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks, Becky. That was
great. Yeah.
Great questions.
I thought it's
going.
Yeah, I had.
It flew by. The time went so quickly. I could. Do you want to do part 2?
I think we might shortly, abruptly, you'll find the event will just abruptly end. So at least I think you don't need to stop the recording. You can just end the event and then it'll be fine. It'll save. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.